about 6 or 7 years now, and I'm really pleased she's able to take the time. Cristi is, as you have read, the founder and CEO of Global Press, and she's the publisher of Global Press Journal, both of which she founded in 2006 to change the face of international journalism by building women-led news bureaus in some of the world's least covered areas. This was in response to her work as a foreign correspondent, where she felt they weren't getting really good information, and she was told, you can't get better information than this talking head in a government room. And she didn't buy into that. So she created her organization, and Global Press now operates more than 40 independent news bureaus in 13 countries and offers free republication of all its stories in 6 languages, and works to strengthen the media sector by driving new standards of ethics, investigation, and transparency, which is probably the most important even of all 3 of those, because that is exactly what you don't get in most foreign coverage. Global Press has in its lifetime received recognition from a variety of institutions, including Fast Company magazine, the American Psychiatric Association, SOS International, Inc. magazine, and the Stevie Awards. Cristi is also an expert through her work in international journalist security, and she's the lead author of the Global Press Style Guide, which is a language resource that's now used by more than 100 news organizations and educational institutions. She holds a master's degree in journalism from New York University and a bachelor's degree from Loyola Marymount University. Additionally, Cristi is an Emerson Collective Dial Fellow. She's also an Ashoka Fellow and was a social entrepreneur in residence at Stanford University. She is the recipient of the Society of Professional Journalists Journalism Innovation Prize, the Jefferson Award for Public Service, and the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism, among others. And so as you can see, Cristi is a very, very accomplished woman, but she's also the proud mom of her 2-year-old son, Henry, who may be her very greatest achievement ever. I first met Cristi at the Opportunity Collaboration, where she was an instructor for the Bohm Media Fellows program. And she never fails to impress me with her depth of knowledge and her dynamic personality. So without further ado, I think you're gonna find the same as she talks to us. And I introduce to you and give a warm welcome to Cristi Hegranes. Take it away, Cristi.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm really happy to be here with you all, and really glad that there's just a handful of you so that we can really spend some time doing a deep dive into making this as absolutely beneficial for your specific organizations as possible. What I wanted us to do today is we'll start with some introductions, and then I want to talk about really 2 main things. One is types of media opportunities, and then really focusing in on audience goals so that we can make sure that we are building strategic and aligned media opportunities for your organizations. So to kick us off, I would just love to get a quick introduction from each of you. Who are you, your organization? Noelle, can I start with you?
Absolutely. So I'm here representing Boys Hope, Girls Hope. I actually work for the network headquarters. We are an organization of 15 affiliates that are international. In particular, the West Foundation funds our affiliate in Guatemala. And our mission is to nurture and guide motivated young people in need to become career ready, well-educated men and women for others. The majority of the young people we serve come from extremely backgrounds of extreme poverty, but they are very bright, energetic, and just don't have access to resources that others have. And so that's what we focus on, is building those resources. And we work with young people from middle school all the way through college and career launch. So we spend a large portion of their lives with them. In particular, our Guatemala affiliate has a number of residencies and 2 schools where they serve all of these young people. And it's been a very interesting time because Guatemala has had very different experience with the pandemic. They are just now starting to be able to emerge and do things in person, but they've really persevered and done some great things, and their young people are amazing down there. So thanks for this opportunity to meet with you and hear about what you do.
Yeah, that's awesome, Noelle. Noelle, thank you so much for that. 2 quick follow-up questions for you. What are your main media goals and priorities, either for yourself or the organization? Do you just have like 1 or 2 goals that you have in mind?
I think one of the biggest goals for Boys Hope, Girls Hope is just to build awareness of who we are beyond just the regions that we're in. For example, in the areas where we are, the cities that we are, we're relatively well known, but a lot of people don't understand that we're actually this affiliated network, and we have the power of that network, and that we're impacting these lives in such a broad way. So I think the largest goal is just to build awareness of who we are and what we do in a broader way. I think that's the biggest goal that we have.
Got it. Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks so much. All
You're
right,
welcome.
Emily, go ahead. Welcome.
Emily Paver, correct? I know we have 3 Emilys on the call today, which is fun.
Really, you guys are probably used to it. I
Yes.
am not in my generation.
Thank you again for having me. I'm glad I'm actually going next. I was going to volunteer because my nonprofit also works in Guatemala, so I was thrilled to follow Noelle. My name's Emily Paver, and I'm the marketing manager for Cooperative for Education, and we're a Cincinnati-based nonprofit that also has an office in Guatemala that focuses on education programs, K through 12, ultimately. We have 4 key programs that are helping our students break the cycle of poverty in their families, specifically for the more rural indigenous communities. And so Noelle knows very well what we do, and also everyone from the West Foundation, because they've been amazing longtime supporters. So we are thrilled that you offer this resource to us. And I've been on the team for almost 4 years now, and it has been a very interesting time to try and support our students in the way that we're used to, and our teachers as well. So we've definitely turned those obstacles into opportunities with more virtual trainings for our teachers, offering more digital resources and take-home resources for our students. But I think, to go ahead and answer your question, Cristi, since I think you were going to ask, is probably our biggest barrier is location and being able to create media, create content that ethically and beautifully represents the people that we're serving, but not being in country. That's one of the biggest hurdles for me as our marketing manager, is getting high quality media that really does a great job representing our beneficiaries when I couldn't travel there, which was very difficult. So I was able to go in July and get some great content, but all of the people we have on the ground in Guatemala have much more important things to do to serve our students. So it's also a priority, but it's not the biggest priority because we're trying to serve our students first.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much for that. That's super helpful to understand. And Florence, hi, welcome, Florence.
Hi, I'm Florence Reed, or Flo, and also about the only one from my generation with this name. And I'm with Sustainable Harvest International. I'm the founder and director of strategic growth. We've been around for 25 years now, running basically the same program, which is providing technical assistance in agroecology to families living in rural areas in Central America. And the 3,000 families that have been through our program are able to increase their income enough to meet all their basic needs and beyond, like sending children to college, and doing it with farming practices that increase biodiversity and help to stabilize the climate, and also providing food sovereignty, since they end up growing most of the food to feed their families on their own land. And recently we've launched a new initiative to reach 1 million farms by 2030, the Million Farm Transformation. So that's a real focus for us now to build on our experience these last 25 years and to have a much broader impact. And we're interested in working more with media in the countries where we currently work to raise more awareness of the work that we're doing and why we're doing it in the countries, trying to raise up the voices of the farmers in the program and bring their perspective more into the conversation, and also to get our message out in other countries where we're hoping to find partners that will work with us to co-create variations on our methodology so that we can reach that big audacious goal of 1 million farms. So that's from my interest here.
Got it. Thank you so much. That is really, really helpful. Well, I'm thrilled to have the three of you with us. What we're going to do now is really more of a conversation. So I'm going to go through just a couple of key points, and then we can pause at any point that you have questions. Okay. So first, I want to talk about types of media opportunities that nonprofit leaders can and really should be taking advantage of, and then dispel a couple of myths about some of them as well. So there is, of course, the profile, right? The feature where, you're in the New York Sunday magazine and, the entire article is just about your organization. That's often considered like the holy grail of media coverage. But I'll tell you two things, which I'm sure won't break your hearts. They're really uncommon. And readership of those articles tends to actually be pretty small. So we definitely always want to work towards that as a goal, because it certainly can't hurt, right? But what I want to spend most of our time focusing on today is two other really powerful media cultivation strategies that can actually lead you to that feature, or even better, get your work in front of more eyeballs and more target audiences. Okay. So two other really common ways that nonprofits can find themselves in media are, one, getting your work mentioned as part of a larger story tied to an event or a trend, right? So for example, here in the US, we've seen a lot of coverage recently about access to contraception in different states within the US. You will often see in those stories that a local nonprofit organization working to help solve the problem are featured in the story. The story is not about them, but their work is featured as one solution or one key voice on the topic or the issue, right? So that's one, is really positioning your work tied to events and trends. The other one, which I think is probably the least coveted in the nonprofit space among nonprofit leaders, but absolutely the most impactful, is getting yourself or key members of your organization to be a regular source for reporters on key topic areas where you are an expert. Okay. Now, I will tell you, I have utilized this strategy for 16 years now, since we first started Global Press. And in that 16 years, probably about 10 articles have been written solely about Global Press. And I mean big, good articles. I have been quoted in about 700 articles. Okay. So here's a big question for each of you and for key members of your team. What are you an expert in? Right? Now, often as women, as people in the nonprofit space, we, say, oh, well, I'm not really an expert in anything, but, I'd like to talk about, no, we are not here for that today. What are you an expert in? What can you speak powerfully and clearly and impactfully about in your work, right? Is it, is it farming? Is it, education in Guatemala? Be specific, be broad, but really spend some time thinking with yourself, what are you an expert in? That if I called you up as a journalist and I said, hey, I'm really looking for data on, food sovereignty in XYZ place, can you help me out? You would say, damn right I can, and here's what I have to say about it, right? So it's really important that we cultivate topics of expertise for ourselves. Right? I'll give you an example. Last August, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, there was so much coverage of journalist security in the country. Now, for context, I've never been to Afghanistan. Global Press doesn't operate in Afghanistan. I don't actually know that much about Afghanistan. I was on the radio, I was on television, I was in article after article as an expert in journalist security, because I am, in fact, an expert in journalist security. So I was able to get the message of global press, duty of care, holistic security for local journalists. I was able to get our message of really high quality care for journalists out in a complex moment. I was able to raise my brand profile, the brand profile of global press, and provide a really helpful different opinion from a lot of what the more mainstream organizations typically think about journalist security. Right. So this is an example of how you can pivot and position yourself and your organization around key events and trends, right? This also isn't just for you, right? Any member of your leadership team or any member of the community that you're thinking about media training or that you want to be a spokesperson of your organization, you should be really clear on what those areas of expertise are, okay? For two reasons. One, because what we don't want to do is speak outside of our area of expertise, because that presents a credibility problem, right? All of this is credibility building, right? Now, if CNN International would have called me up and said, hey, Cristi, can you speak to the specific journalist security challenges for female reporters in this province of Afghanistan, I would have said, I cannot, but let me introduce you to two people who might be able to. I can't do that. And I'm not going to do that, because the last thing I'm going to do is look like an asshole on CNN International when I'm trying to look like an expert, right? That is like media tip number one. Don't look like an asshole when you could look like an expert, right? So be really clear about what your areas of expertise are, right? Flo, what is your biggest area of expertise? Like, you are a top expert that if I was a New York Times reporter, I should call you every time I have a story about what?
Smallholder farmers in Central America.
Love it. Absolutely. Yeah. We can get you in the Rolodex of a handful of journalists who are writing about that topic, and they would probably want to talk to you regularly, right? Emily Paver, how about you? What is your greatest area of expertise that the world would be blessed to hear from you more about?
It would be sustainable education in rural areas, specifically Guatemala as the example.
Okay, sustainable education. That's super interesting. And Noelle, how about you?
So I know we weren't supposed to say this, but I am not an expert in these areas, because I'm on board as a grant writer and fundraiser in my organization. But I will say this: our CEO is the expert, and she is not only an expert in youth development, particularly and empowering communities of poverty, but before she was our CEO, she was the head of our Latin America development. So she is particularly an expert on youth development in rural Latin American communities. So that's the person I'd want front and center answering all those questions and advocating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is super valid. And you want to really make sure that you know, right, especially if you're in a position of development support or marketing support, you know, who in your organization can and should be speaking to what topics, and you can help develop those strategies for them. But Noelle, not letting you off the hook quite that easily, because fundraising in this moment is a deeply important topic. And, you know, we often do Chronicle Philanthropy articles or Stanford Social Innovation Review articles talking about innovative practices, talking about, you know, I did a piece in 2020 about funder bad behavior, right? People who all of a sudden took the pandemic as an excuse to walk away from a lot of like multi-year grant commitments. And like, that's not cool. And somebody had to talk about it. So it was me, because fundraising is a real area of expertise that I have as well, right? So really thinking through, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the audience section, there are different reasons to do different types of media, right? There are different reasons to, you know, writing that Stanford Social Innovation Review article was for a very specific audience, and it was to send a very specific message. Whereas, you know, doing CNN International on journalist security in Afghanistan was for a very different audience for a very specific reason, right? So we want to be really strategic about where and how we're placing our organization in the overall media landscape to serve a variety of different goals, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we actually make this happen. How do you become a regular source for key journalists in your space, right? Easier said than done. So how do we actually do that? First and foremost, know who's writing about these subjects, right? Is there, there is a really small team of legacy journalists, legacy media being like Washington Post, New York Times, AP, Reuters, really small subset of journalists who cover Central America generally. Find out who they are, follow them on social media, read their work, and engage with them as much as possible, right? If you read an article by someone who you're like, wow, this is the only reporter in America who seems to understand sustainable education, follow that person, share their work, right? I will tell you, in this journalism market, journalists are really paying close attention to who follows them and who shares their work, because they are really responsible for a lot of the reach of their own stories, right? So find reporters whose work you like. Okay, that's number one. Follow them. Once you share their stories, also reach out to them with non-media coverage requests, right? So journalists are inundated with Twitter DMs and emails that are like, hello, please cover my organization. The kind of outreach that is most likely to get a journalist's attention is one that is like, hey, thanks so much for your article last Friday on X, Y, and Z sustainable seed being used in Guatemala now. My organization has 15 years of consolidated data on the topic. We also have an archive of stock photos that you could use, and our executive director is always available to you as a source. Here's a link to her recent TEDx talk or whatever it is, right? So you are a helpful collaborator. You are positioning yourself as a person who would like to make that journalist job easier, and chances that they're going to get back to you are really, really high, right? Similarly, you can, let's say a journalist makes a mistake, right? A reporter covering something in Guatemala, says a statistic wrong or kind of, misrepresents something in your opinion. Reach out to them and say like, hey, I really loved your article. I had some questions on your use of this 36% stat. My organization has deep expertise in the area. We gather our own data. I'm obviously making all of this up. So like take what is like applicable. Our data shows this. I'd love to chat with you or set you up with a meeting with our executive director to talk through any discrepancy. Once again, look at you. Aren't you helpful? You're like introducing yourself to the reporter in a way where you are knowledgeable, you are expert, you are a collaborator, and most importantly, you're reading their work. Okay, all of those things matter so much to a working journalist, right? You can also reach out with just basic offerings, right? Maybe not tied to a specific article, but does your organization have access to photos? Do you have access to data? Do you guys produce regular press releases that you would want to send to them? And once you've done a couple of outreaches, it is totally fine to say, Emily, I think to your point earlier, and also Flo, to your point about really like letting farmers speak for themselves. That is such a powerful piece in media right now. It's something we focus on a lot at Global Press, this notion of representation, right? Too often, particularly international media, but media in general, tends to be a lot of white elite organization, people speaking on behalf of others from a much more data-driven approach. One of the richest things that you can offer to a journalist is to say, hey, I've seen in your past coverage that you are really interested in, food sovereignty and climate change throughout the Americas. Our organization has a network of farmers or a network of students or whoever it is that I would be happy to introduce you to, so that we could actually bring in experiential expertise into these pieces, right? This notion of credentialed versus like lived expertise is really important, and something that journalists do increasingly value. Right? Journalists are under significant pressure to differentiate their coverage from their competitors. If they are all using the same newly released UN report or newly released World Bank report, having access to your farmers, having access to your students is a big draw. And so making that offering can be a real game changer and a journalistic willingness to get in touch with you. Now, if you're going to offer that, you should do some level of media training with the people that you are offering to the press, right? First, obviously, you want to get the local person's consent. Second, you want to make sure that they are prepared to say like a really succinct 1 to 2 line description of your organization's work. And you want to just kind of prep them and coach them around what it is to do an interview with a journalist, right? For example, really simple things like answer the question that you were asked, or don't answer the question you are asked, right? Those are 2 really specific strategies. If a journalist says to you, tell me a little bit about how, failed governance in Guatemala has really led to, farmers doing XYZ thing. And your farmer's like, ooh, I'm kind of uncomfortable with that question. Like, I don't know that I want to say on the record to the Washington Post that my government is a total failure in like agricultural systems, right? So you want to train your participants to say, there are so many challenges in the local, whatever market, whatever it is. My focus is on XYZ, and instantly pivot, right? Pivot to where they're an expert. So really teaching them to, regardless of the question that they're asked, like still say the thing that they want to say, right? And most journalists know that that's what's going to happen anyway. So for example, recently, one of my reporters in Mongolia was on PBS NewsHour talking about some of her recent coverage from Mongolia that got a pretty specific government response. The reporter on PBS asked her on camera what the government's, whether or not the government's response to her story had been threatening. She didn't say yes or no, right? Because both of those things, it would have been problematic to say yes, and it would have been untrue to say no. So she didn't say yes or no. She said, working as a journalist in Mongolia is a constant negotiation between the truth and like government sources. In this particular story, I'm really happy that I was able to blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden she's over here talking about her message, and we're not even talking about the government anymore. Right. So really making sure that you're prepping anyone in your organization or any beneficiaries of your organization with 2 or 3 key points, right? Whatever they ask you, these 2 or 3 key points is what you pivot back to, right? So let me pause there and we'll just talk about any questions that you have on this approach to becoming a regular source. And I just really want to highlight as well that this gives you the opportunity to be in a lot more news stories, right? It gives you the opportunity to have way more eyeballs on your work, right? Because just think about it. If there's an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine this Sunday that's like, why sustainable education matters. And I'm like, I don't care why it matters. And I turn the page, right? Or if there is article after article where, someone is being quoted talking about a new approach to education and defining sustainable education and giving me good examples of why this matters, all of a sudden I'm getting it on multiple different levels, whether or not I chose to read that 3,000 word feature about your organization, right? So it helps you get in front of more people. It really helps with brand credibility. Now, all of a sudden, imagine in the news page of your website where you can say, quoted in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, this, that, the other, right? It really helps with brand credibility. And here's the ultimate truth. Journalists follow journalists. So if the journalist at the Washington Post is talking to you all the time, the journalist at the New York Times is going to call you too. Right? So it can really help to build that like snowball of media awareness around your work. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions about this strategy of positioning yourself or your organization as a regular source for journalists. Go ahead, Flo.
I guess I feel like we've tried to do a little of this in the past, but hearing sort of your very clear steps for how to do it is definitely going to be helpful. And I should say that we've tried to do in the past with very little success. So I think taking some of what you've already said will help, but I also still wonder sort of how much of this engagement do we need to do with reporters in order for them to be thinking of us when they're looking for an expert. Sort of clearly a one-off comment on one social media post isn't going to do it, I imagine. If you're inundating them every day, I don't know that they'd appreciate that.
There's no magic answer, except that we want to find the middle ground between like trying to be lucky and being obnoxious, right? So like you post one comment on somebody's Twitter feed somewhere and they're like, oh my God, that's super interesting. Let's have a conversation. That might happen 1 in a million times, but also like every day, like, hi Bob, it's me again. Do you want to talk yet? Like also no, right? I would suggest doing things like really thinking more about specific journalists than specific publications, right? Because in this industry, in this market, journalists move all over the place, but their beat tends to stay the same, right? If you're a climate reporter, like you might be a climate reporter at ProPublica today, but the New York Times tomorrow, you're still a climate reporter, right? So following the journalist rather than the publication is key. And then set a Google News alert for yourself with that person's name. So every time they write a story, you get it, and you can start, regularly sharing their stuff, regularly commenting on their stuff. And then I think the other piece is find genuine and credible opportunities to offer yourself or your organization's assets, right? So I think where this strategy can fall down is if like you find a general climate reporter and you're constantly pitching them on food sovereignty, even maybe they've never written about food sovereignty, maybe they don't actually care, right? So it's like go from topic to like really specific, and then make sure that you're positioning yourself with really genuine offerings that could be helpful to increase the chances that they take you up on it.
Yeah, I do have a question. So what are the best next steps? Say you do get featured in a publication that you've been longing to get featured in, and you are harnessing it in all the ways you can really think of, promoting it to your base in emails, social media, all of that. Is there anything that maybe we're forgetting that we need to try and do to really maximize that visibility and this great option? Because we just got a cover and an 8-page spread in Rotary magazine, which is something that we've been trying to get for many, many, many years. And it came kind of out of nowhere. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited about it. But of course, we didn't know until we received the publication in the mail that it actually happened. So we're thrilled. And we've been sharing it with our base, but what do you recommend? Like, how can we harness this momentum to really maximize this opportunity?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think this is, if it's an 8-page spread or a 1-sentence quote in a story, I think the answer is the same, right?
Okay.
Making sure that you are actively tagging the publication and the specific reporter. For Rotary Magazine, I'm not sure if it's online or if it's just
it's both, yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, what a lot of organizations will do is be like, we're so excited, we got this article. A way more impactful but similar thing to do is, thank you so much @journalist for this really accurate and compelling feature of our article, of our work in @magazine, right? So like the follow-up is really key, right? Not just follow up with the reporter, but follow up certainly with the reporter, but also anyone else at the publication, or leveraging that article to get other articles, right? So you might say, hey, reporter at our local newspaper, Rotary Magazine just did this 8-page spread. Here it is. Check it out. Did you know that the founder of the organization lives in this city and that XYZ thing is an issue for what, right? So leveraging it with other publication partners, because again, media follows media, right? There's actually a wildly problematic principle in journalism called selective distortion, right? That essentially means something that has been a story before is likely to be a story again, which is why we have such like rote narratives about most of the world, because story follows story. This is an opportunity for you to use that to your benefit, right? To say, hey, it's been a story here, let me help it be a story there. You can also angle it, right? So if you said, hey, Greenpeace magazine, this great feature in Rotary Magazine just came out. We would love to talk to one of your journalists about doing a deeper dive into X avenue of our work. Maybe it's regional, maybe it's topical, maybe it's data driven. So it's called angling, where you can you look at your organization as a whole and what are all the different angles, right? So my angle, for example, is yes, global journalism in general. Representation in media is kind of a wide topic. Journalist security is kind of a wide topic, but also you'll hear me on an NPR interview next week talking about the really specific problematic word choices that journalists are often making in their coverage of Africa, right? For example, the number of times that mainstream journalists refer to housing in Africa as mud huts, right? So we'll take all these things that I'm an expert in and we'll angle it. And we'll say, yeah, there's a really specific show where they're talking about word choice and worldview. And I'm going to be on that show too, right? So you can kind of angle your work to be really specific. Does that answer your question, Emily?
Yes, it was great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, any other questions? A couple of things that I think follow on Emily's question and are also just key points to think about. Making sure that your websites have good SEO, good search engine optimization are really key, right? So that when you post, I hope you have an in the news section on your website, or if you don't, you do soon once you start getting a lot of press. Making sure that it's really searchable, right? So let's say I'm a journalist and I'm, covering some really specific education story. And I'm like, gosh, I really need a news source. Let me Google sustainable education. You better be the first thing that comes up, right? Or maybe the second, or maybe the third thing, right? So that, so that I'm not, because I'm not, as a journalist on deadline, I'm not going to go to page 9 of Google. So is your website really keenly optimized in line with those areas of expertise that we talked about at the beginning, right? And here's the good news. SEO optimization is way easier now than it used to be. Like, you can go on Fiverr and hire someone to SEO optimize your website for like $30, right? It's like, it's not what it used to be. So really making sure that your website's SEO translates to those expertise areas, so that if as a journalist I'm looking for, you know, organizations providing contraception in Ohio, you're gonna get served to me really quickly. That's one thing. The other piece is a social media presence. And I don't mean that you have to have like 1 billion followers. I mean that your social media presence has to be really clear. It is critical that your like about page on Facebook or your like little about line on Twitter is not in nonprofit jargon speak, but is much more tailored to like a regular audience and journalist speak, right? So if you're like catalyzing the impact of something at scale, you did it wrong. Whatever it is, like, you did it wrong, right? It's got to be like a really clear, straightforward, we are a thing that does a thing that is important because, right? Like, that's all that matters. Because again, if a journalist is searching Twitter, they're not going to pause to figure out what catalyzing impact at scale in the realm of blah, blah, blah is. They're like, oh, cool. These people are doing the thing that I'm looking for, right? So just doing like a quick audit of any external presentation of your work. Is the summary, is that like 1-2 sentence summary? Is that compelling for this type of audience, right? Any questions about that? Okay.
No, I just want to say that's the message that we all need to hear over and over again, and that we all struggle with. We actually just had a conversation about this, whiteboarded on it. Like, how are we presenting our message to help, to help people understand that aren't on the inside of what we do? And we use so much jargon. So good to hear. Thanks for repeating that lesson.
It's so true. I mean, I think impact is definitely one. Outcome is the other. Like, regular people don't use the word outcome the way we use the word outcome, right? Like, that's not a thing regular people. Theory of change, impact, words like catalytic and like, it's not where most people live. And what's really interesting about that is it's actually a real turnoff for people who are not in the space, right? Don't tell me that you're catalyzing impact at scale in the realm of farming and whatever. Tell me, tell me how many farms you're serving and like why that matters, right? So I think like just getting a much more like declarative, active voice version of what we do is also really appealing to a journalist. For 2 reasons. One, because it makes their job easier to find you, but also the last thing a journalist wants to do is to get on the phone with you or your executive director or whoever to hear all about, the theory of change and the industry-wide blah, 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 blah. Like, they don't want that, right? You want to really media train people to speak in like clear, short, impactful. Let me tell you a quick story about a journalist who just completely transformed access to information across Zimbabwe, right? Yeah, I'm here for that. Let me tell you a quick story about a farmer who did whatever, right? So really just making sure that your messaging is crisp and clean, I think is so, so key. All right, let's stay on this for just a second. Oh yeah, go ahead, Flo.
I wanted to circle back, if you didn't mind, to the SEO question. I know our communications manager has done work with that. I'm also pretty sure, and I just tried it with agroecology, but I think if I tried it with climate solutions, with Central American farmers, with most of the things where we would like people to, find us on that first page, we're not there. And I assume it's because now there's a lot of people that are working in agroecology and writing about agroecology and nature-based climate solutions and all the other things that we'd is there an answer to that?
I think so. One is, Google has a very generous Google Ads program for nonprofits.
We do that, yeah.
Yeah, so
And we use nonprofit megaphone too, which has been very good.
That's great. So I think for Google Ads in particular, making sure that you are as specific as possible, and to not waste your Google AdWords with things like climate change, because like you're just not going to come up, right? But if your Google Ads are really, really specific, so for example, at Global Press, our Google Ads, because we have the $10,000 a month Google ad grant, like most organizations these days do, I think, we will put in terminology that's specific to actual headlines, and we'll change it every single day, right? So like Zimbabwe, and like we're a news organization, we produce tons of stuff every day, like that's probably not applicable to you guys, but I'm not going to have Zimbabwe as one of my AdWords. I'm going to have Nelson Chamisa rally as one of my AdWords, right? Like the guy who's running for president, who's having a rally tomorrow, as one of my AdWords. So to be as like specific as possible, because again, the chances that a journalist is searching like climate change, farming, I don't know, that's not really like a place to start, right? They'd be starting much more specifically, and you want to just do what you can to lead them to you. So I would reverse engineer the exercise and maybe do an exercise with yourselves, your leadership teams, around like, what are the areas of expertise where you would really like to garner some media interest, and then tag your AdWords back to that strategy.
Good advice.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about media training. We talked about it a little bit for, beneficiaries, but it's also important for your leadership team within your organization. Practice is like the most basic advice, but like the best advice. You should never be saying something for the first time when you're talking to a journalist, right? That is just a not good thing to do, right? Something coming out of your mouth for a very first time, like on the record, or like God forbid on TV or the radio, you just don't want to do it, right? And so I think the task, and maybe part of your job if you're in development or marketing, is actually just forcing people to practice. So for example, when we have big new brand messaging, what I will do with team members is I will have them present the new thing at a team meeting. That's practice. They're talking about it. Then I'll have them come to a board committee meeting and talk about it again. And then I'll have them come to a full board meeting and talk about it again. And then we might have, a group of who knows who over here and they say it again. Now all of a sudden they've practiced the message publicly 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 times. It's like, oh, also you need to go on NPR next week and talk about this. And they're like, oh, cool. Yeah, I've already said that 100 times. That's totally fine. Right. So just creating opportunities for people to practice their messages, speaking really succinctly and powerfully about your work, right? Because here's the truth. No one cares what your mission is. They just don't. Like no journalist on earth is ever going to be like, and their mission is to. They're not going to. They care what you're doing in the world and why that matters. So we are often so trained, those of us who live in like the fundraising space, to like lead with mission. You have to intentionally break that habit for people in your organization that you're putting in front of the press, because that is a giant snooze button, right? We don't want to start with our mission is, right? I don't start every interview with, I founded Global Press 16 years ago in order to, like, what, snooze, no one cares. It was 16 years ago. If somebody's trying to give me $1 million, I'm going to like rewind it back to the beginning and tell the whole story. If I have 90 seconds on television, that's not where I'm starting, right? So really training your staff, the difference between fundraising presentation and media presentation is really important. It's also really important to have tons of practiced examples ready. Right? So you shouldn't be like, oh yeah, there was that one time, I'll get you the details. Nope, you know, Robert, on this farm, on this date, this thing happened, this is the result, this is what's going to happen next, right? You have really clear practiced examples, and you should always have more than one, right? Because the journalist might not use the one that you want. If they come back to you for another one and you don't have one, you actually just decrease your credibility in their eyes, right? You should have 5, you should have 3, you should have 1 million, right? However many it's important for you to have based on the topic. And then I think the last point is to just position yourself as helpful to the reporter. So even if it's not about you, like the example, if somebody came to me asking about a specific province in Afghanistan, I would say like, hey, I'm not your girl for that, but do you know so-and-so who works at this organization? I'd be happy to introduce you, right? There's still a way to position yourself as a helpful collaborator for the reporter. Any questions?
Yes, I do have a question.
Please.
This isn't specifically related to anyone I know, but we're all here representing, you know, different organizations with different types of leadership, different numbers of people. How would you handle it if the person who has the expertise doesn't want to really talk to the media, or you know, is really, you know, whether it's just because they're really shy or they just don't have, you know, strong communication skills? I know you talked about practicing. Do you have other strategies that you use with sources who have, you know, a really great wealth of experience or knowledge, but you know, for some reason or other lack the ability to put it out there in a really effective way?
Yeah, that is an important question, especially because it is not everybody's cup of tea, right? But there are ways to set people up for success. So for example, if your executive director does not want to go on television, I hate going on television. Like, I understand, like, it's a thing that like needs to happen, but like if somebody's like, I can't go on TV, like I'm just like, I have a face made for radio and like I'm not going on TV, don't put them on TV. Or build a longer term strategy with someone and start with telephone interviews, right? Where if somebody needs to be reading something, they can read it and not look super sketchy. So maybe start with the phone interviews, maybe then like move to radio or podcast, and then like kind of move up to that as folks get comfortable. There is media training available too, right? There are great firms that do this and prep people. I still use a firm. I am just writing a book that's coming out in a couple of months, and one of the big pieces of my book is actually pretty critical about mainstream media. And so I'm working with this super mean media training firm in DC, and they're just like beating the shit out of me in these meetings where they ask me like mean, horrible question after mean, horrible question, so that when that happens to me, which I'm sure it will when the book comes out, I'm not going to be like, oh my God, I don't know, why are you being so mean to me? I'm going to be like, cool, I'm ready. I practiced that answer a bunch of times and like, I'm ready for you. When it comes to like beneficiaries, I think that's where you have the opportunity to like pick and choose a little bit more. If you do have beneficiaries or people in your organization who just are naturally more charismatic or like really well-spoken, etc., like tap those people. It does unfortunately just happen where sometimes the people with the best stories are just not suited for the press. So then I think the thing to think about is, do you invest in teaching that person? If the answer is no, what we want to be careful about is who we choose to speak for them instead, right? So always defaulting to the like white male executive director to give the message of the beneficiaries in the community is like probably not the best choice. But are there other ways that you can spread that message beyond that one person without creating like a problematic representation dynamic in how your organization is portraying itself in the press? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That was very helpful.
So, all right, well, I think just a last quick thing to really think about is audience and who do you want to read something? I think oftentimes the standard is like national press or like international press, when that is, again, not always the most impactful, right? A smaller publication or a more targeted publication is often a better brand credibility or readership option for you than, again, being buried on page like A36 of the New York Times. So just being really clear, is this a story for people in your local community? If so, you've got to think about language. You have to think about accessibility, right? One of the key things to remember, especially for you all working in Guatemala, foreign correspondence as a discipline is about people that it is not for, right? So Guatemala will never be the target audience of a New York Times reporter covering Guatemala, right? The story's not going to be in Spanish. It's not going to be distributed. It's not going to be accessible probably for a variety of reasons. So if your target audience is the local community, choose media sources that actually serve that community, right? And then, yeah, really leverage it for credibility, right? Add it to people's bios, right? If your executive director starts getting quoted in the New York Times all the time, add a line to her bio that says, you know, a frequent source for the New York Times and other media because of her expertise on blah, 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 right? Leverage these media opportunities to create brand credibility for your organization and your key staff.